Hi, fifth grade. Let's keep reading. Don't go into the principal's office. We're on chapter 3. Let's get out of here, I whispered. I've seen enough. No, we need to wait until he leaves, Ted whispered back. We have to get those hospital clothes and that scalpel for evidence. Why? When he operated on Sammy, he must have cut him open somewhere, so there's probably still blood on them. Sammy's blood. Oh, yuck. It'll help convict him in court, Ted added. He was planning to be a lawyer just like his father. So we waited while Mr. Amstead continued to perform his pretend operation. But after half an hour, when he still hadn't stopped, I said, I can't wait for him all day, Ted. I've got to go home. My parents will be wondering where I am. Ted sighed, just our luck. So we hurried back up the steps and left the basement. When I got home, I had lots of explaining to do. My parents think if I'm even a minute late coming home from school, something awful has happened to me, which is really strange because on Friday nights, they let me hang around the neighborhood with my friends until almost 10 o'clock. I came up with what I thought was a really good excuse, but I was still put on TV restriction. That was okay. I had a lot to think about anyway. That night, I talked to Rebecca about lobotomies again. Tell me all you know about them. It's an operation performed on violent, uncontrollable mental patients to calm them, she said. The nerve fibers leading to the frontal lobes of the brain are cut. Then she got her father on the phone to give me even more gruesome details. By the time he had finished, I was more convinced than ever that no matter what the consequences, Ted and I should have waited in that basement all night, even if we had had to, just to get the evidence to help convict Mr. Amstead. Well, we'll just have to try again, Ted said when I saw him in front of the school the next morning. But how? I asked. There's no telling where the hospital clothes and the scalpel are now. Ted gave me a wide grin. Oh, but there is, Richard, there is. Why do you think Mr. Amstead went down to the basement in the first place? I shrugged. Because he was looking for a place to hide all of the stuff he used to operate on Sammy, that's why. Ted was obviously proud of his reasoning here. I hadn't thought about that. You're probably right. There is where Ted usually mentions his keen legal mind. Fortunately, this time he didn't, but I knew it was only a matter of time. He just nodded. So we went into the building, slipped down the steps to the basement, past Mr. Cooligan, who was stoking the furnace, and discovered that the hospital clothes and the scalpel were no longer where we had last seen them. Maybe he put them somewhere else down here, I said. We should have gotten them last night, Ted said between clenched teeth. My legal mind told me that we should have. I smiled. Ted was pretty easy to read most of the time. I'm sorry, I couldn't help it. I was already in trouble when I got home. You're sorry? He let out a big sigh. Ted's parents aren't nearly as strict as mine. Well, being sorry won't put that man away. So now he's free to perform lobotomies on the rest of us kids. We don't know for sure that's what he was doing, Ted. I tried to counter. Rebecca only thinks that was what he did. But I said it so weakly that Ted knew I didn't believe it myself. Wait a minute. We do have some evidence. It's probably upstairs right this minute. What do you mean? What evidence? Sammy Shell. We could use him as... What are you boys doing down here? We looked up and saw Mr. Cooligan staring at us. In the shadows, which were lit only by the fires from the old coal furnace, he looked like a monster himself. Well, are you going to answer me? He demanded, or do I have to send you to the principal's office? A chill went through me. No, I shouted, no. A slow grin spread across Mr. Cooligan's face. Then I suggest you go back upstairs right now and never come back down here again. I swallowed hard. Okay, I said as Ted said, come on. When we were at the top of the stairs, Ted said, I wouldn't be surprised if old man Cooligan wasn't in on this some way. Get on, get out of here, Mr. Cooligan was standing at the bottom of the stairs, grinning up at us. Ted opened the door slowly. All we needed now was to run into Mr. Amstead, or any of the other teachers for that matter, because going down to the basement was an offense punishable by weeks and weeks of staying after school. Is the coast clear? I whispered to Ted. I could hear Mr. Cooligan starting up the stairs. Maybe he decided to do something to us after all. Maybe he himself had found the hospital clothes and the scalpel and hidden them. Maybe Mr. Amstead had told him to do it. Maybe they were in on this together. Hurry, Ted, I whispered frantically. Is the coast clear? No, Mrs. Johnson's out in the hall talking to someone. She'd see us if we left now. Mr. Cooligan's steps seemed louder. "I told you boys to leave," he said in an ominous voice. "I guess I'm gonna have to show you what happens to kids who comes down to my basement when they know they're not supposed to." At that moment, I pushed Ted through the door. I decided I'd rather face the librarian's wrath than Mr. Cooligan's. But just as we came back into the hallway, Mrs. Johnson turned her back. She and the student she'd been talking to were walking down the hall in the opposite direction. I closed the door to the basement and said, "That was too close for comfort. Let's go on to class." "But what are we going to do about Mr. Amstead?" Ted demanded. I opened my mouth to say something, but the door to the basement hit me in the back. Mr. Cooligan was coming out. "Let's get out of here," I cried. I started running down the hall, another offense punishable by death. Ted was right behind me. We turned the first corner out of Mr. Cooligan's sight just as the final bell rang. "Oh, great," Ted muttered. "Now we've had it for sure." "No, I've got an idea. You stay right behind me and out of sight." I ran on ahead and ran into our classroom. Miss Matlin was already calling roll. She looked up at me and frowned, but instead of taking my seat, I ran up to the front of the room and whispered, "Ted's really sick in the restroom. He threw up all over the place. You ought to be glad he did it in there and not in here." She pulled away in horror. Well, you need to get Mr. Cooligan to clean it up," she whispered back. "I just talked to Mr. Cooligan and he's busy," I whispered, "but I'd be glad to take care of it myself for my best friend." "Well, that's very nice of you, Richard, but you really don't." I held up my hand to silence her. "That's what friends are for, Miss Matlin. Do you think he should go home? Maybe we should call his parents." I shook my head. No, I think it's all out of his system now. It's all green and yellow and slimy looking." From the look on her face, I could tell that Miss Matlin was about to get sick herself. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "I'm going to go get him now and bring him to class." Mrs. Matlin started to protest, but I ran back out of the room before she could. Ted was waiting for me just outside the door with a very puzzled expression on his face. "Are we in trouble?" "No, but try to look like you've been throwing up, okay?" I counted to 10, then started pulling Ted into the classroom. I didn't look at Miss Matlin or the rest of the class, but I could tell they were looking at all of us. We took our seats and started looking at our math books. Then I glanced over at Sammy. I couldn't believe it. He had on a suit and a tie and was sitting quietly at his desk. His math book was open to the correct page, and he seemed to be following what Miss Matlin was saying. This is really weird, I thought, and couldn't help but wonder where Mr. Amstead had made the incisions when he'd cut out a part of his brain. I stared at his head for several minutes, but then I finally turned away, and I didn't look up for the rest of the morning. I didn't hear much of what Miss Matlin said. All I could think about was what had happened to those hospital clothes and the scalpel Mr. Amstead had used when he'd operated on Sammy's brain. When we were finally dismissed to go to the cafeteria, Sammy asked me if I'd like to eat with him, but I said no, I had other plans. He shook hands with me and said that we'd have to do lunch sometime. "That guy is really weird," I told Ted on the way to the cafeteria. "Really weird." "What did he mean, do lunch?" "He meant eat lunch. His brain must be all scrambled up." Ted nodded. "What's left of it, that is." As we got our trays and started towards our table, but I stopped about halfway there. Rebecca and Bobby were already sitting at our table, but so were Ronnie Baylor and Franco Fryer. They were the two other members of San Michelle's goon squad. Thank goodness they weren't in our class, because they were even worse than Sammy had been. "We need to find another table to eat at," I whispered to Ted. "Why?" he said. Then he saw the reason. "Oh, yeah, I see what you mean." But it was too late. Ronnie and Franco had seen us and were motioning for us to come sit down. "I guess we don't have a choice," Ted said. "I guess not." I could feel my tray shaking as we started towards the table. "What do you want?" Or "what do they want?" Ted said under his breath. "They probably think we know all about what happened to Sammy because we sit next to him in class," I muttered back. "They may even think we're in on it in some way." "We could drop the trays and run," Ted said. "I've already thought about that. It won't work. First of all, they'd catch us, and second of all, we'd get sent to the principal's office for sure, for messing up the cafeteria floor. So you're saying we're dead either way, right? Right." We'd finally reached the table. "Sit down," Franco said. "We've got something to ask you guys." "We didn't do it," Ted said. I kicked Ted and sat down. "Ask away." I was trying to sound as though I hadn't the slightest idea what they were talking about. "Pass the salt, please." They just looked at me for a minute, then Franco passed the salt. I shook it all over my plate. Do you always salt your pizza? Franco asked. Felt like an idiot. I was trying to be so cool. I hadn't even realized what I was eating. Sure, I said. I sprinkled even more salt on it. I probably wouldn't be able to eat it now, but I wasn't sure I was going to be able to eat anything anyway. I looked up. Everyone at the table was staring at me. I picked up my pizza, took a bite, and couldn't believe how awful it was. I took a long drink of water. Then I looked at Franco and Ronnie and managed to grasp. So what do you guys want? We want to know what happened to Sammy, Ronnie said. I took another bite of my salty pizza and choked out, What makes you think we know what happened to him? Yeah, Ted added. Maybe he just got some class, that's all. Franco stood up. Are you saying we don't have class? No, I gasped. I took another drink of my water. Ted just means that he doesn't see anything wrong with Sammy. He's turned into an extremely nice individual, that's all. He's weird, Ronnie said. I can't even understand him when he talks. I thought we'd all agreed he'd had a lobotomy, Rebecca said. Robbie and Franco looked at her. A what? A lobotomy, Rebecca repeated. Ronnie and Franco turned to me. What's she talking about? Oh, nothing, I said. Will someone please pass me the salt? All right, we're going to leave it here, guys, so we don't have to have two parts. See you tomorrow.